It's time for another faction review, and we are back with another cool, very popular faction in AOS 4.0. It is the time of the dinosaurs, with the Seraphon up next, and with a relatively new and stunning refresh on a lot of their kits, from Saurus warriors to Kroxigors to the great Kroak himself. There is quite a lot to be excited about. Alongside that, they get some very cool battle traits, and we start these off with their Asterism abilities, which are part of their Great Plan. The Great Plan lets you, in your deployment phase, pick an Asterism ability, and this is in effect for the entire game, so it's a really nice army-wide buff that you can pick depending on what you need the most. And the unique thing about this, and the unique thing about the Seraphon, is that they get to add to this with their rule furthering the Great Plan, which lets you in Battle Round 3 pick a second Asterism ability to go off on the proviso that you have completed a certain action or condition based around your first choice. Now, the Asterism options come in 4 varieties. Itzel the Tamer gives your companion weapons on Seraphon units the crit 2 hits rule, so for your monster mash lists this will make them even scarier when they do hit combat. Quetzal the Preserver is more of a defensive one. This means you subtract 1 from the rend of enemy attacks whilst your Seraphon units are wholly within friendly territory, so it's more of a castle style build that is going to boost your durability quite a lot, although it can be quite limiting if you do need to push out into the enemy part of the board. Sotek the Deliverer is a mobility focused one, giving you a very simple but very effective buff of 2 inches of extra movement on all of your Seraphon units, which makes you a very fast army, and your cavalry in particular quite terrifying in the right situations. And then finally, Tepok the Seer is your magic focused choice. This gives you a tasty +1 to casting rolls for friendly Seraphon units, and is just a general all-round good one if you are going with a lot of casters. So they're all fairly specific, they are fairly good at buffing you in a particular way, but what I like about this is it means you can really cater this to benefit your army and your style of play really nicely. The option to then get a second one is really good, and say taking the 2 inches of extra movement as the base one and then hoping to go for perhaps the +1 to cast or the crit 2 hits rule seems like a very potent combination to me. But as I mentioned earlier, you do have to fill certain conditions to get that second one. So if you picked Itzel, you have to have killed 3 or more enemy units by Battle Round 3 to choose a second Asterism ability. If you picked Quetzal, you have to have no enemy units in friendly territory to pick a second. If you chose Tepok, you have to have a friendly Slann unit on the board and have no Slann units either in combat or have been destroyed. And then finally, if you had picked Sotek as your deployment phase 1, the enemy general has to be in combat or have been destroyed for you to pick a second. So they can be somewhat difficult to achieve. Certainly having a Slann alive if the enemy is going to be gunning for them could be quite tricky by Battle Round 3, as could making sure that, you've got no enemy units in your territory, because if your opponent knows that they can do this to try and deny you getting a second Asterism ability, they're just going to try and do that just to stop you from getting that second option. In my mind, I think picking Sotek is the easiest and arguably best first choice. More movement is always brilliant, and then killing the enemy general, or at least having him in combat by Battle Round 3 is, let's be honest, it's quite a good idea to do anyway, so it's going to benefit you in terms of the overall game plan, and it's a fairly easy one to achieve and have going by Battle Round 3 so that you can pick a second ability. The battle formations don't play into the Asterisms, but they do all each provide a fairly nice buff to your army as well. Eternal Starhost is your mobility one. This gives you a once per turn in your movement phase ability called Celestial Translocation, which lets you pick a friendly unit wholly within 12 inches of a Seraphon wizard, and on a 3+ they can be picked up and set up again anywhere on the battlefield, 9 inches from enemies. So it's a great way to get near an objective or near an enemy unit or just away from a scary one that you don't want to be in combat with. It is just an all-round good utility ability. Nimble and Quick comes with the Shadow Strike Star Host. This is all around your Skink units, and it lets you pick 3 Skink or Skink Cavalry units in your shooting phase that aren't in combat, and they can each move d6 inches. Now, they can't move into combat, but this lets you really get some extra mobility from those units to back away from the enemy or to get close to the enemy if you want to do some shooting or maybe even get a charge off, although not entirely sure why you would want most of your Skink units to charging into the enemy, but you could if you really wanted to. The Monster Mash is also here and accounted for in Scaly Monstrosities of the Thunderquake Star Host. This is very simple, but if you are going monster heavy, it is very good. It is just a flat 2 extra health to all of your monster units. So all of those Carnosaurs, those Stegadons and that sort of thing, they will just be that bit more durable for their cost. And then finally, we have the Sunclaw Star Host. This is probably my favourite. This brings the Vengeance of Azir, which buffs your Saurus and your Kroxigor units, giving up to 3 of those units a pile-in move at the end of any turn, and then also letting you do some mortal damage on a 2+ on a d3 to a unit they're in combat with. So it's just some extra mobility and potentially 9 mortal damage to enemy units every turn. So just sign me up for that. I think it's really good, and I think if you are going in any way heavy on Saurus or Kroxigors, this is probably going to be the go-to pick. I also think the Seraphon have done quite well out of the heroic traits and artifacts, with some very, very good ones and also some quite easy ones to take advantage of. The traits are all passive, which is great, and they are all very useful on the right hero. The Being of the Stars is a simple ethereal style rule, letting you ignore save roll modifiers. It is both positive and negative, of course, but it does mean things like your Saurus heroes will have a 4-up save that can't be worsened, so it can be very nice on them, practically doubling their health against non-mortal wound attacks. The Beastmaster trait is another simple but very strong 2 inches of extra movement to friendly cavalry and monster units wholly within 12 inches of the bearer. So again, for a cavalry or monster heavy list, this goes really, really well with something like the Sotek Asterism trait, getting you up to 4 inches of extra movement and making a turn 1 charge a very real possibility on some of your units. The final one is Reptilian Courage. This lets you use the all-out attack command for free on a unit that is wholly within 12 inches of your hero, as long as that hero has also charged this turn. So sending in an old one with, say, a unit of Aggradon Riders is now really dangerous, because you can be getting them to +1 to hit for no cost in your fight phase. In terms of your artifacts, these two are very good. Starting off with a once per battle one in Coatl Familiar. It may only be once per battle, but you get to add d6 to a casting roll after you've attempted a spell. So it can turn that fail into a success, or just make it much, much harder for your enemy to unbind that spell. So it is quite niche, but can be absolutely game winning if you use it at the right time and on the right spell. The Incandescent Directresses is in any hero phase. You can heal d3, so again on something like an Oldblood on a Carnosaur, this can get you a good chunk of health back every turn, and they can just keep themselves topped up turn after turn after turn. And then finally we have the passive Blood Rage Pendant. This is another just nice, simple, solid +1 attack on the bearer's melee weapons, but you get an extra bonus. You get +2 attacks if the bearer has taken more than half of their health in damage, turning your melee heroes into these really scary blenders as they take more damage. It is just a really solid way to turn a unit that is going to be in combat a lot and taking damage into something really, really scary, even as the enemy does start to chip them down. So just in general, some great traits, some great artifacts, but of course they get even better with some of your spells. And the Seraphon have 2 laws to pick from: Celestial Manipulation and Primal Jungles. The Law of Celestial Manipulation is up first and comes with Mystical Unforging as its unlimited spell. This lets you pick an enemy unit within 12 inches on a 6+, and they are at -1 rend on their weapons until your next turn, so making an enemy unit a lot less impactful into you and giving your already somewhat durable units even more lifespan against your opponent. Comet's Call is your damaging spell. It's on a 7+, and like we have seen in a lot of armies elsewhere, this lets you pick an enemy unit within 18 inches and you roll a dice for each model in that unit, and on a 5+, they take a mortal damage. So it is again just a great anti-horde spell and great for clearing out those big units of zombies and the like. And then finally, we have the Speed of Huanchi, which is cast on a 6+, and lets you pick a Seraphon unit wholly within 12 inches of the caster, and they can run and still shoot or charge. So again, on something like your Aggradon Riders, with the right setup and buffs, they could be getting 4 inches of extra movement and still be able to run and charge, which is quite frankly terrifying and could potentially let them get a massive 32 inches of movement in a single turn, which is just incredible. So there are 3 very good, very useful spells in that lore, but of course if you wanted to, you could instead look at the Law of Primal Jungles. The Unlimited is Light of Chotek, which is cast on a 6, and it lets you pick a Seraphon unit wholly within 12 inches, and they can roll a dice equal to the number of damage points they've taken, and they heal 1 for each 4+. So if you've taken 10 damage, you will on average get about 5 health back, which is fairly solid on some of your bigger monsters. The Earth Trembles is cast on a fairly challenging 8+, so it's not easy to get off, but with this you pick a unit on the battlefield within 18 inches of the caster, and you draw a line from the caster to that point, and all units, both friendly and enemy, take mortal damage on a d3 roll of 2+ if it passes over them. So this can be great if you can line up a load of enemy units to hit with it, but it can also hurt your own guys, and whilst 18 inches isn't a small range, if the enemy is spread out across the board, it's quite likely you're probably not going to get more than 2 or 3 units with this, so it does have a lot of potential. It's just also quite expensive in terms of casting value and isn't always going to be the easiest thing to use if you need to avoid some of your own units to avoid them getting damaged too. Finally, we also have Empowered Celestite. This is cast on a 7+, and it lets you pick a Saurus unit specifically within 12 inches, and they get +1 rend on their melee weapons. If you are going Saurus heavy, this could be great, getting you a load more punch to your attacks, and making them a really quite scary, hard-hitting anvil unit against a lot of enemies. So both are good laws. I think I prefer the Law of Celestial Manipulation just a bit more, but they do both have very good spells in, and I think you could easily bring either of them and make very good use out of them. But now onto the units themselves, and the Seraphon have a really cool, varied and unique collection of units, being a load of lizards, dinosaurs, lizards riding dinosaurs, and also frogs. And we start off with the oldest of frogs, Lord Kroak himself. Kroak is fairly pricey at 460 points. He is a sub 500 point god character for sure, but still he is fairly pricey for what he does, to be honest. He's decently durable with 18 health and a 4-up save and a 4-up ward to protect him, and a lot of his cost does come from the fact he is a 3-cast wizard. Now, he only has a 5-inch move, but he can fly, and let's be honest, he really isn't meant for combat anyway, so that isn't a huge limiting factor. What Kroak does is magic. He is good at magic. He's got some token shooting and melee, but nothing super amazing. His Gaze of Kroak is d6 damage, but it's only 1 attack, so it's very swingy. But I mean, still, 2s to hit, 3s to wound, and 2 rend is a solid profile, so don't forget about it. In melee, it is just some very swingy anti-chaff with 2d6 attacks on 3s and 3s with 1 rend, 1 damage, and the crit mortals rule, but his abilities are where he shines. He has Supreme Master of Order, which gives him +2 to casting, which is already just brilliant, and it also stacks with the Tepoch Astrim too, making him a very, very reliable caster. But on top of that, he can also unbind anywhere on the battlefield rather than just within 30 inches. Now, of course, 30 inches is still fairly generous, but it means he can hide away from all the enemies and still disrupt their magic really quite effectively. He's also an arcane vessel, which means that once per turn in any hero phase, he can pick a Skink Wizard wholly within 18 inches of him, and he can cast a spell through them. So he doesn't even need to be close to the enemy to cast. As long as a Skink Wizard is within 18 inches of him, he can basically channel his spells through them instead, which again makes him much, much harder for the enemy to kill. What makes him even harder though for the enemy to kill is his ability to heal all of his health at the end of any turn. Now, yes, this may sound insane, but it definitely doesn't mean he's unkillable. Basically, you roll 3d6 at the end of every turn when Kroak is damaged, and you add the damage points that Kroak has to the total, and if the roll is over 20, he dies. So if he's taken 3 damage, he could technically die despite having 18 health, because if you rolled 3 6s, your total would be 21, and he would just immediately die. So it can make him super, super tanky if you keep rolling low, but at the same time it's really swingy and he can die a lot quicker than you would expect. The average on 3d6 is 11, so you really need to start to worry about this after you've taken around 9 or 10 damage usually. His final ability is his spell, which is Celestial Deliverance. It's cast on a 7, so he can get it off pretty reliably most of the time, and you can use it multiple times per phase. You get to pick 3 enemy units within 12 inches of Kroak, and you can roll a d3 for each, and on a 2+, they take that much mortal damage. Now, it is just chip damage really, but he can cast it 3 times, and he can cast it quite reliably too, so he could, if you rolled perfectly, do up to 27 mortal damage, 9 to 3 separate units in a single magic phase. So it is quite good, and with his +2 to cast, he can definitely get this off at least a couple of times to kill off some pesky chaff units that may be wanting to get in his way, or just to help kill off an enemy monster or hero. Overall, Kroak he's got a lot of potential, but I'm not sure he's worth his nearly 500 points. He can be very, very swingy in terms of his durability and his output, and whilst his casting is very reliable, I would say it's not on a par with people like Nagash or Teclis in my opinion. So he is good, I just don't know if he is worth taking when you could potentially be better served by the much cheaper Slann Starmaster. The Starmaster is a much cheaper 280 points, so very nearly 200 points cheaper. They do only have 9 health and a 5-up save and a 6-up ward, so they are very much squishier than Kroak. But in terms of their rules and abilities, they do a lot of what he does. Their own damage output is pretty pitiful. They've got 6 attacks with their Azure Lightning, which isn't going to do much with only 1 damage, but they are good casters. You get another 3 cast Wizard, which gets +1 to their casting thanks to Masters of Order, and they still also get that ability to unbind anywhere on the battlefield, so they do bring some brilliant utility. It's just not quite as good as Kroak's. They are also arcane vassals too, so they can use that rule to have a Skink Wizard as a proxy, so despite being squishier, they can still sit back and hide quite effectively and still get most of the benefits of their unbinding and casting when you need it. They also get to buff friendly Seraphon wizards nearby with their own spell Celestial Equilibrium, which is cast on a 6 and gives +1 to casting rolls for other friendly wizards wholly within 12 inches, so this is great for just buffing up a skink before you do a spell through them with your arcane vassal rule. But where I think they really make their points back over Kroak is Celestial Reinforcements. This is once per turn in your hero phase. You can pick a friendly Seraphon unit with 3 or more models that has been destroyed, and on a 4+, you can set up a replacement unit with half the number of models, 9 inches from enemies, and 12 inches of the Slann. So that big blob of 20 Saurus warriors, you can get 10 of them back, essentially netting you a good 170 points back in one fell swoop. So overall, I think yes, these guys are less durable than Kroak, but they can still do most of what Kroak does, and they get you some potential returned units over the game. So for 200 points cheaper or so, I just think he is a better pick 90% of the time. Next up in terms of wizards, we move on to the Skinks, in particular a Skink on a massive Troglodon. With a hefty 10-inch move, 14 health and a 4-up save, they certainly look like they are more of a threat than the Slann in terms of profile, but they are just a one-cast wizard. So in terms of spellcasting output, they do fall quite far behind. The Skink Oracle on Troglodon is 280 points, so they are the same cost as a Slann, but as you can clearly see, their melee output, not to mention their ranged output, is far superior. They get d6 shots from their Noxious Spittle, doing 2 damage on 3s and 3s with 1 rend, which isn't a bad little shooting profile, and then whilst they are no Carnosaurs, they get 7 attacks in melee that hit on 4s, wound on 3s or 4s, and then do multiple damage, the Talons doing 2, the Jaws doing 3, and then the Divining Rod doing d3. They've got a total potential output of 19 damage in combat, which really isn't terrible, and even with just average rolling, they're going to do around 4 or 5 damage to a 4-up save infantry unit, so no, they're not super killy, but they can fight off smaller chaff units really quite well. Of course, being a monster, they also get a rampage, and theirs is Noxious Roar. This lets you pick 3 enemy units that they're in combat with, and you roll a dice for each, and on a 3+, that enemy unit is -1 to hit for the turn. So they can also make themselves a little bit more durable too, which is handy. And then they also heal d3 at the end of any turn with their Troglodon regeneration. So they can stick around and keep around even if they are in combat for a deceptively long time. They also get a nice little tactical play move with Terror, which reduces enemy control scores by 2 when they're in combat with you. So they're a bit killy, they're a bit of a caster, they've got some good mobility, they are just an all-rounder unit. But of course, having another wizard is always a good thing to have, so if you wanted a more mobile, slightly killier wizard, this isn't a bad way to get it. And of course, being able to cast Slann spells through this guy because he is a skink is also really good, because with his 10-inch move, you can get him where you need him to be before you cast the Slann spell through him. If instead you want a pure melee monster though, then the Saurus Oldblood on Carnosaur is where you want to look. He is a hefty 330 points, so he is pricey, but again, with a 10-inch move, he is fast, and with 14 health and a 4-up save, he isn't super tanky, but he's not exactly easy to kill either, especially with some of the buffs and traits you can get from your artifacts and your traits on offer. So he is good, and he is ridiculously good in combat. He's got 5 spear attacks that are 3s and 3s with 1 rend and 3 damage on the charge, 4 attacks with the claws, which are 4s and 2s, 1 rend and a flat 3 damage, and then a further 3 attacks with the Carnosaur's jaws, 4s and 2s, and with a flat 3 damage, but 2 rend this time. So compared to the Troglodon, he can do around 11 damage to a 4-up save enemy, so he's much, much scarier, and he is very capable of wiping out entire 10-man units all by himself. But he does also bring some great buffs. He gives your Saurus units +1 to charge if they're wholly within 18 inches of him and he's charged, so again, going in with something like your Aggradon Riders is a very nice prospect with this guy. And he can also give himself strike first with his Rampage Blood Frenzy. It is only on a 3+ and only against damaged enemy monsters, but they are definitely a great target for him, and he can just absolutely obliterate any monster that might be unlucky enough to find themselves in combat with him. Also, like the Troglodon, he causes terror for that -2 to control scores, so even in terms of objective play, he is pretty good. He can just charge in, kill almost anything that he is in combat with, and then even if he doesn't manage to kill it, potentially debuff it so that he can steal the objective from them. Instead of the Oldblood, you could go for the Scar-Vet on Carnosaur. He's a bit cheaper at 270 points, and he has the same 14 health, 4-up save, and terrifying Carnosaur attacks. He's got no range though, and his melee weapon, his spear, doesn't get the +1 damage on the charge. He also has some slightly different War Scroll rules. His Rampage is Maim and Tear, which is done at the end of any turn. He can pick a hero that he's in combat with, and you roll a number of dice equal to the damage points that hero has taken, and on a 5+, they take 1 extra mortal damage. So if you were in combat with, say, Nagash, and you had done 10 damage to him, you would roll 10 dice, and on each 5 or 6 do an extra mortal damage. So it can be good as enemies get more and more injured, you are more and more likely to do some more damage to them. So he's definitely not bad, I just don't know if he's as good as the Oldblood on Carnosaur. If you instead want to take a Scar-Veteran but have something a little smaller and cheaper, you could take the Scar-Veteran on Aggradon. He's a solid 180 points, but he is of course a little less durable. He's only got 8 health, but still does have that 4-up save, which is fairly solid. Now these guys are very, very fighty in combat for their cost. He's got 4 spear or club attacks that are 3s and 3s with 2 rend and 3 damage on the charge, whilst the Aggradon itself has 3 great attacks. They only hit on 4s, but they're 3s to wound and then 2 rend and 2 damage, which is great for a mount. And they are also companion attacks, so can potentially be buffed via things like your battle traits too. His rule is Primal Rage, which means he generates rage tokens at the end of each turn if he has fought, and for each token up to a maximum of 3, he gets +1 attack to his Aggradon's talons. So it can get up to 6 attacks, which is incredibly good. Now he does lose the tokens if he hasn't fought, but if you can get this guy into combat and fighting each turn, he will just blend through so much with those attacks. He can also really punch it up for a single turn with his rule Alpha Roar. This lets you pick him and an Aggradon unit wholly within 12 inches of him in any combat phase, and they all get +1 attack on their companion weapons, and they also gain a rage token, again up to a maximum of 3. So with this, if that got you to the full 3 tokens, he alone could have 4 spear and 7 talon attacks, meaning he would be doing nearly 9 damage to a 4-up save by himself, which is just brilliant output for his cost. He is a great hero unit if you didn't want to splash out for something like a Carnosaur, but you were still going for a cavalry heavy list. The Aggradon Lancers themselves come in units of 3, and for 210 points they are not cheap, 70 points each, but with 5 health and a 4-up save and their melee output, they can be very much worth it. 3 spear attacks, which are 3s and 3s, 1 rend, 1 damage, but 2 damage on the charge, and also 2 rend against monsters on top of their own talon attacks from their Aggradons, which as before are 4s and 3s, 2 rend and 2 damage, means they can rip through a lot in combat, and they do also get that Primal Rage rule, meaning they themselves can get up to 6 talon attacks each. So a full unit of 3 can have 9 spear attacks and then potentially 18 talon attacks, which is just going to put a dent in pretty much anything they charge into, especially a monster. And for a quick bit of reference, the talons alone will do 10 damage to a 4-up save unit, so even without the spears, they can take over half the wounds of something like an enemy Carnosaur or big monster, so they are just very, very good at killing things. Moving away from the cavalry, there is also a regular Oldblood who is on foot. He is a cheap 130 points and nets you 7 health and a 4-up save. He's fairly choppy with his Celestite weapon. It's 5 attacks on 3s and 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage, but he also buffs Saurus Infantry nearby to him by giving them +1 to wound rolls when they are wholly within 12 inches of him. This is only once per battle, but it could absolutely swing a combat in your favour very easily with that fairly significant buff to their output. He also gets the usual fight and then choose a friendly infantry unit near him to fight straight afterwards with Predatory Exemplar. This is always pretty good and great on something like Saurus Warriors. For 130 points, if you are bringing those Saurus Warriors, he's probably a worthwhile pick just to take alongside them. And on the topic of the Saurus Warriors, they are next. They come with their brilliant newish models, and they are 170 points for a unit, which is 10 models, so 17 points for a 2 health, 4 up save unit with a 5-inch move. They are, in a way, sort of like more defensive Chaos Warriors in my mind. They have that similar 2 attacks, which are 3s and 3s, 1 rend and 1 damage, but unlike the melee output boost that Chaos Warriors get, their rule is Ordered Cohorts, which gives them +1 to their saves when they are contesting an objective that you control. So they are very, very good at sitting on circles and just holding them. Of course, what makes them really good in my opinion is that they combo really well with a fair few of your battle traits and your formations and other hero buffs, and you really can make them incredibly tanky or incredibly killy quite easily, depending on just how you want to leverage them. The more elite Saurus Guard are unfortunately still the old models, which do look pretty bad in comparison to the newer ones. They are also a lot pricier, with 5 of them costing 110 points, so these are 22 points each. They do have the same 2 health, but they've got a 3 up save and also 1 extra attack for the cost. They are almost mandatory if you take a Slann, because their rule of Selfless Protectors gives both them and a Slann in their combat range a 5 up ward. So you can be rocking around with a 3 up save, 5 up ward, and boosting your Slann's ward by 1 as well as putting out 3 attacks per model. I'd say they're not great, but they are very, very good at keeping a Slann safe, and if you are bringing a Slann, you will want at least 1 unit of these just to go around with him. I do also hope they get some new models soon, because they do absolutely deserve them. Moving on, we have a couple more Skink heroes next. First up, we have the Starseer. This is a slightly heftier 2-cast wizard, so he already has a lot of value. He's pretty cheap for a 2-cast wizard at only 150 points, but he is somewhat squishy with only 6 health and a 4 up save. In melee, he's nothing to write home about. He's got 2 attacks on 4s and 3s with 1 rend and D3 damage, so he isn't going to do much, but again, he is a wizard. His own spell, Celestial Doom, is pretty great. It's cast on a 7, so it's not guaranteed, but what it does is it lets you pick an enemy unit within 18 inches, and they can't make ward saves for the turn. So turning anything death or demon or a big enemy hero into a much easier prospect for your Saurus or Carnosaurs or Aggradons to deal with. And if there are a lot of ward saves in an enemy army, this spell really can pay dividends. He also gets Scry the Stars, which you only can do once per battle, but when you use it, you roll a number of dice equal to the battle round, and for each 3+ on those dice, you can pick a Seraphon unit wholly within 18 inches of the Starseer, and they get a 5 up ward until your next turn. So saving this for battle round 3 is, in my opinion, a fairly safe bet, meaning you will likely get 2 units that you can put that ward onto. So it's a solid buff on something like your Saurus Warriors or your Aggradons, because they don't have a base ward save. So using this ability well and timing it well is quite a big important deal for making sure your big blocks survive a certain combat. So he's pretty good, I think. I do love 2-cast wizards, and he does have a great spell all by himself. So I think he is definitely worth those 150 points. If you wanted a cheaper version, the 110 point Star Priest is another option. He's only 5 health and a 6 up save, so he is definitely squishier, and he is of course only a 1-cast wizard, so that is a lot to give up for 40 points. But what he can do is buff quite well. His Serpent Staff lets you pick a Seraphon unit wholly within 18 inches, and in your hero phase, you can roll a dice, and on a 2+, you give that unit the crit auto wound ability. So this can make a big unit of Saurus Warriors really quite scary with their output. Now, is he worth giving up that second cast? I'm personally not sure, but if you are squeezed on points and you want those auto wounds on a particular unit, he could be a relatively cheap way to get that in, and you would at least still have a one cast wizard to potentially channel your Slann through. The generic humble Skinks also make an appearance, although without a fancy new set of models unfortunately. These guys are 10 points each and they come in a unit of 10, and I think they're maybe a little bit overpriced. They're 1 health and a 6-up save, so they're really quite squishy. They do have a solid 8-inch move, and they can be an okay harassment unit with some token shooting from their javelins, but they're mainly a screening unit for your more important stuff. And they can actually be quite tricky to pin down because their ability to redeploy is a bit more reliable thanks to Swift and Nimble. And what this does is it lets you roll 2 dice for your redeploy distance instead of just 1, and you can pick the highest. And I think that's fairly good because you don't want these guys anywhere near the enemy, because in melee they are awful. They've got 1 attack that hits on 4s, wounds on 5s, with no rend and 1 damage, so that is bordering on zombie levels of pathetic. So they don't really do much, they are just a somewhat useful screen. I would just say they are maybe a tad pricey for doing that in my opinion. The Spawn of Chotek is the brilliant replacement unit for the old Salamander and Razordon models. It is just one combined unit kind of thing now. It is 170 points with 8 health, and it is a beast with a 5-up save, so it's not super durable, but it does have some fairly good shooting attacks. It can either shoot a glob of flame acid, which is 1 shot at 16 inches. Now it only hits on 4s, but it does wound on 2s, and is 2 rend and d3 plus 3 damage, so it can do a lot of work if it does hit. If it does cause any damage to the enemy, that enemy unit is -1 to their save rolls for the rest of the turn. So it can be a cheeky little debuff piece too before you charge in with some other units. The slightly more reliable shot is the 5-shot Stream of Fire. This is 2s and 3s, but it is only 1 rend and 1 damage. Now it does go up to 2 rend against infantry, so this is more your anti-chaff, anti-infantry clearer, whilst the Glob of Acid is maybe if you are wanting to play a bit more risky and go for that big d3 plus 3 damage into something like a monster or an exposed hero. It can also do some okay work in melee with its Fiery Maw. It's only 3 attacks, but they are 3s and 3s, 2 rend and 3 damage, which is a fairly solid profile. It does put just over 3 damage into an enemy 4-up save, so it can deal with some harassment units that may be trying to lock it up or tie it down in combat as well. Up next we have more cavalry, this time in the form of more Skinks, the Raptadon Hunters and the Raptadon Chargers. Both are 3 health with a 5-up save and a brilliant 12-inch move, and they come in units of 5 for 140 points. The main differences are that the Hunters are more ranged focus, with 2 shots each from their Starstone Alatals that are 4s and 4s, 2 rend and 1 damage, and they also have a nice little play with the Chargers, which are the melee variant, a unit of Raptadon Chargers that have charged this turn and are within 12 inches of the Hunters. That allows the Hunters to shoot at that enemy unit, so they can shoot in the charge phase before any fighting has taken place to potentially do a bit of damage to an enemy unit that your Chargers have gone into. As I said, the Chargers themselves are more melee focused. They've got a Tepok Lance each, which gives them 3 attacks that hit and wound on 4s with 1 rend and 2 damage on the charge. And then they both also get a set of attacks from the Raptadons, which are 3 attacks, 4s and 3s, 1 rend and 1 damage. So it's nothing amazing, but just a few extra hits to throw in. But what the Chargers get is they get a passive Cold-Blooded Unity. And what that means is that they get +1 to hit rolls if they target a unit that was shot at by friendly Raptadon Hunters in the same turn. So if you are bringing these, you really want a unit of each to support each other. You have the Chargers charge in to let the Hunters shoot in the charge phase, and then you can get +1 to hit with your Chargers when they swing in because the enemy has been shot. Overall, they're not bad and they do combo quite well together. They are a nice pair of harassment cavalry units, but as I said, they do need to be brought together to really get the most out of them, and if the enemy kills off one of the units, either the hunters or the chargers, that makes the other unit a lot less useful. The regular foot skinks did actually get some new models though, just in the form of a Warcry warband. The Hunters of Huanchi, these do keep the same 1 health and 6 up save, so they are still very, very squishy, but they do actually have a 5 up ward, and they come in 2 variants, either 5 with Starstone Bowlers or 5 with Dart Pipes. The Starstone Bowlers are 90 points and have a fairly mediocre ranged attack. It's 1 shot that hits on 3s, wounds on 4s with no rend and 1 damage, but when they target an enemy unit with their bowlers, you can roll a dice, and on a 3+, that enemy unit gets 1 less dice to roll for their charge rolls. So it can massively impact a potential enemy charge that your opponent may be planning. So they do have a lot of use just in terms of slowing down your opponent, which could very much make them worth their points for that rule alone. If you instead go for the Dart Pipes, they are a cheaper 80 points, and they have a slightly better shooting profile. They're 2 shots on 3s and 3s, again no rend and 1 damage, so it's still not exactly amazing, but what they get is the Star Venom rule. And what this means is if you do any damage to an enemy in the shooting phase, with your Dart Pipes, you can roll a dice, and on a 2+, that enemy unit is -1 to wound for the rest of the turn. You can quite nicely debuff an enemy unit before you charge in, or you do this in their turn before they charge into you. Both sets of the Hunters also get the ability to deploy hidden away and then get set up on the board through their Chameleon Ambush, which allows them to set up 9 inches from enemies in your movement phase, so you can easily get them into range when you need them to, and put one of those nice debuffs onto the enemy. I would say overall, they are good. They definitely have their uses. They are just quite pricey considering how easily they will die if the enemy so much as looks at them. Seraphon armies can also bring some flying beasties in the Terrawings. 3 of these cost you 100 points, and they net you a 2 health, 5 up save profile with a 12-inch move. They are beasts, so they only have a max control of 1, and they don't do a huge amount in melee. They are 3s attacks each, but only 4s and 4s with no rend and 1 damage, so it isn't going to do much. Their main use is to turn off commands for your opponent, which they can do with nerve-shredding screeches. You get to pick an enemy within 10 inches of them, and you roll a d3, and if that roll is more than the enemy's control characteristic, then they can't use commands for the rest of the turn. So turning off the ability of 1 or 2 control units to do all-out attack or all-out defense is quite possible, although it does say you have to exceed the enemy unit's control characteristic, so it's only going to be super reliable against enemies with a control value of 1, to be really honest. But now we move on to some of the bigger monsters, and starting off we have the 2 Bastiladon options, one with the Ark of Sotek and the other with the Solar Engine. The Ark of Sotek is the cheaper of the 2 at 270 points, and it nets you 12 health and a whoppingly good 2-up save, which is just incredible. He really will be sticking around for a good long time. The Ark gives a melee attack which is very swingy, but it does have a lot of potential. It's 20 attacks. Now they only hit on 4s and wound on 5s with no rend, but they do have the crit mortal rule. So you could do up to 20 mortal damage with this, although realistically, you are looking more along the lines of doing 3 or 4. On top of that, you do also have a bludgeoning tail for 3 extra attacks that are 3s and 3s, 1 rend and d3 damage, so you can do a solid bit of work into the enemy in melee with this, but then there is also the Arc ability itself, which is once per turn, and it is your Rampage. This lets you pick 3 enemy units within 9 inches, and you roll a d3 for each, and on a 2+, you do that much mortal damage to them. So it can spam out a lot of mortal damage into enemies, and it is of course very, very durable while it does so. The slightly pricier Solar Engine variant is 290 points, and it's got the same 12 health and 2-up save, but instead of the 20 attack melee profile, it instead has the 18-inch range, 3-shot solar engine. This hits and wounds on 3s with 2 rend and a flat 3 damage, and it also has the crit 2 hits rule, so you can be getting up to 6 hits with this, but even with average rolling, you are looking at just over 4 damage into an enemy 4-up save, so that doesn't sound super amazing on the face of it, but the option for spiking it higher is there, and could get you up to a maximum of 18 damage if you were super lucky. It also has a rampage. Tail swipe is this one, and this lets you pick an enemy unit in combat with your Bastiladon, and you roll a dice for each model in the unit up to a maximum of 8, and on a 5+ they take 1 mortal damage. So it is essentially around an extra 2 or 3 mortal damage into a big enemy squad before you swing with your bludgeoning tail. It could probably do with a slight buff, I think, on the solar engine, maybe dropping a few points or just having some more reliable damage output, but they are both very durable platforms with that great 2-up save and a very healthy 12 wounds to protect them. If you want even more skink goodness, then we also have a few mounted heroes as well. The Terrawing Chief is a cheeky little 150 points for a 5 health 5-up save unit with a great 14-inch move. He's also -1 to be hit by enemy shooting attacks, thanks to attack from on high, which is really nice, and then he can also drop rocks onto the enemy with Chief's Deadly Cargo. And what this does is it lets you pick a unit he flew over in your movement phase, and you roll a dice, and on a 5+ he does D3 mortal damage to them, and it also prevents them from running if they don't have the fly keyword. So it is a nice little damage and debuff rule there. He's got some melee, but it's not exactly amazing. 5 attacks with his Skyblade that are 4s and 4s, 1 rend and 2 damage with the crit auto wounds ability, and then 3 more from his Terrawing that are 4s and 3s, 1 rend and 1 damage. His fellow Terrawing riders are usually bought in a unit of 3 for 110 points, which nets you a similar 5-up save but only 3 health each, and they have the same rules as the Chief with their Deadly Cargo and also the -1 to be hit from ranged attacks, but they also get a ranged attack themselves with their Javelins. Now it's only a 10-inch range and is 3 attacks that are 4s and 5s, no rend and 1 damage, but they do auto wound on crits, so that is at least something. They are mainly there to go along with the Chief to help keep him safe and basically fly around and harass the enemy by dropping rocks on them. Personally, I'm more of a fan of the Raptadon units. They likewise have a Chief and a regular unit. The Chief for them is again 150 points, and he's got the same 5 health, 5-up save, 14-inch move. He also has the same melee profile with a Skyblade, and the Raptadon's jaws being the same as the Terrawings, but they just also get +1 damage on the charge, so they can be 2 damage when these guys swoop into the enemy. His War Scroll rules are slightly different, with a Blot Toad, which is a token you get for each Chief or Raptadon rider unit in your army up to a maximum of 3, and you can put them by an enemy unit and they are the Blot Toad target. And when you fight a unit with your Raptadons that has a Blot Toad, your Raptadon jaws get +1 attack, which is very nice when they charge in. You can boost that a little bit further too with a once per battle ability Raptadon Assault. This gives you +1 attack on friendly Raptadon rider Moonstone War Spears if they are wholly within 12 inches of your Chief. So he is much more melee focused, and he can actually be moderately scary when all the buffs line up. The Raptadon riders themselves are a bit pricier than Terrawing riders. They are 120 points for 3. The jaws are like the Chief with that tasty +1 damage on the charge, but their Moonstone War Spears are 2 attacks each. They are 4s and 4s, no rend and 1 damage, but they do get +1 rend against cavalry. So most of the damage is coming from the Raptadons, but these guys can actually do a little bit of work into enemy cavalry units too, especially on a turn when the Chief uses that Raptadon Assault rule. But not content with all of those Skink Chiefs, we have one more. We have one on a Stegadon. He is much pricier, naturally, he is 260 points, but obviously he is much more durable with 14 health and a 4-up save, and a still relatively solid 8-inch move as well. He can come with either a Sky Streak bow or Sunfire throwers. The bow is 3 shots that hit and wound on 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage, and they go to 2 rend against monsters, whilst the Sunfire throwers are more anti-infantry. They're 2d6 shots, they hit and wound on 3s, they've got the crit 2 hits rule, and they are also plus 1 rend against infantry. So he can chew through monsters or units of chaff equally well, depending on how you run him. And then in melee, the Stegadon can obviously do a load of damage on the charge, with 6 attacks that hit on 4s, wound on 2s, with 1 rend and 3 damage on the charge. He is a scary threat. He can also command Skinks near him to use their redeploy command for no command points, which is a solid ability thanks to his Skink coordination. And then his Rampage is a very simple one. You pick a unit in combat with him and you roll a d3, and on a 2+ they take that much mortal damage, but it gets a boost if he has charged. You add 2 to the amount of damage. So potentially he can do up to 5 mortal damage into an enemy that he's charged before you even roll any dice to fight. The regular Stegadon is cheaper at 240 points, but not hugely cheaper, all things considered. It still has the same options for the ranged weapons and the same melee output. The only real difference is the Rampage, which is in any charge phase and is called Unstoppable Stampede. This lets you pick an infantry unit and you just do d3 mortal damage to them, but then your Stegadon can move 2d6 and pass through that enemy unit, so you can charge them and then end up on the other side of them. So you do still have to end up in combat, but you can potentially get to the other side of them to tag another unit or an enemy hero that was trying to stay away from your Stegadon. So it's a really nice little mobility tool on top of the d3 mortal damage. One of the options for the Stegadon is the Engine of the Gods. This is 210 points and it loses the ranged options of the Sky Streak bow or the Sunfire bowlers, but otherwise keeps the same profile and melee output. It instead has the Cosmic Engine rule, which lets you harness the power of the engine in your hero phase. You can either choose to reserve the power and place a token next to the unit, or you can harness the power, and if you do that, you roll a dice and you add the number of tokens that the unit has to the total, and then you can pick one of 3 effects. Healing Light lets you, if your dice roll was a 3+, heal d3 to all friendly units wholly within 12 inches of the engine. Starlight Summons goes off on a 5+, so a bit harder, and you may need a few tokens saved up to get this off reliably. You get to pick 3 units wholly within 12 inches and return 1 slain model to each, whilst Time Slows is on a 6+, so you will definitely want to have some tokens reserved before going for this one. But what that does is it lets you pick 3 friendly units and you give them strike first for the rest of the turn. So there is some great ability to bring some models back or heal models in your army, or also get some really good melee output boosts from this unit. And I think for 210 points, it can be a very solid way to buff a decent chunk of your army in the mid to late game, while still having a unit that is not terrible in combat. Like, it's still got those 6 Stegadon attacks that are a good amount of damage and wounding on 2s. Finally, we've got a few more new units. The Saurus Astrolith Bearer is a buffing hero. He's 150 points for a solid 6 health and 4 up save. He's got some acceptable melee with 4 attacks on 3s and 3s with 1 rend and 2 damage, but his main use is his big banner that gives infantry units a 6-up ward save when they are wholly within 12 inches of him, and that becomes a 5-up ward if they already had a 6-up. So it's really good boosting the durability of things like your Saurus warriors. And then he's got a really nice reaction too in Celestial Conduit. This is done after a friendly wizard casts a spell wholly within 12 inches of him. He can give +3 to the control scores of all Seraphon units wholly within 12 inches of himself. So he kind of takes those magical energies and just uses them from his banner to improve your own units further. There are also 2 new units of Kroxigors, the regular and the Warspawn version. They are both 220 points for 3, and they've got a hefty stat line. They are 6 health and a 4-up save each, so they are very, very durable. The Warspawned are armed with Drake Fang Warpicks, and 1 in 3 can take a Starfang Warpick. The Drake Fang is 4 attacks, 4s and 2s, 1 rend and 2 damage, and +1 rend against monsters, whilst the Starfang hits on 3s and is also a flat 3 damage, but otherwise the same. So they are a very, very good anti-monster unit, and they can be even better getting +1 damage on their weapons if there is any Skink Infantry or Cavalry nearby, thanks to their Spawn of Sotek rule. And then they also get some much needed durability with heavy scaled skin, which makes enemy ranged attacks -1 rend into them. So they can definitely survive to reach combat, and then when they are there, they will just demolish monsters so easily. The regular Kroxigor variant are more anti-infantry. They've got Drakebite Mauls or Moonstone Hammers. They both get 4 attacks, but the Mauls hit on 4s, whilst the Hammer hits on 3s, and then like the picks, the Mauls are 2 damage base, whilst the Hammer is 3. They are also all +1 rend against infantry, so it is just a very anti-infantry version of the Warspawned Kroxigors. They do, however, get a slightly different rule in that they get their +1 damage if the enemy unit they're fighting has 10 or more models. So against zombies, for instance, 3 of these guys can be throwing out potentially 40 damage in a single round of combat, which is just nuts, and it does make them especially good into enemy infantry. Finally, we have the terrain piece, the Realmshaper Engine. This is 15 health and a 4-up save, and it gives you +1 to hit for Saurus or Kroxigor units that target an enemy that is within 9 inches of the terrain feature. So this is really solid if you put this nice and centrally in your territory, because there will be a lot of fighting going on around it. It can also boost your wizards that are within 3 inches of it. You get to pick another terrain feature within 24 inches of it, and 3 enemy units that are within 3 inches of that other terrain piece, and you roll a d3 for each, and you do that much mortal damage on a 2+ to them. So it is just some nice extra chip damage to enemies quite a distance away. Like 24 inches is a good distance to be able to impact the enemy, whilst of course making any fighting around your terrain piece that much better for your guys, thanks to those bonuses that you get for fighting around it. Overall, the Seraphon seem pretty great. I think I love their battle traits and their formations, and I think their traits and artifacts are very, very good. The units are also really cool and unique and interesting to build and paint and look at. I do think there is some buffing needed, especially on a couple of the Skink units specifically, but overall, I think the Seraphon can fight well, they can cast very well, they can be very speedy when you need them to, and they have got a good bit of durability on quite a lot of their units. So I like them, I think they are in a good place, and you can really build them to do almost any kind of playstyle you want. The only one you really can't do that well at the moment is like a shooting heavy list. But as always, what do you make of the Seraphon, and which formation do you think is the best? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe for more Warhammer content from me, but until next time, I'll catch you later guys.